Hello and welcome. Today's special guest, and he's extremely special because he's also in our studio, one of our first guests here after nearly 1.5 years, is Vir Sanghvi. He is, of course, has been one of India's best-known editors and has had a unique insider's view into the world of prime ministers, changes of governments, political scandals, changing societies, and much, much more. His memoir, A Rude Life, has a cast of characters that ranges from prime ministers from Rajiv Gandhi, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, Narasimha Rao, other prominent political figures like Sonia Gandhi, also of course Mr. Narendra Modi, and Amitabh Bachchan, Dhirubhai Ambani, and many more. For that you'll have to read the book. But to talk on a rude life and a new India, Vir Sanghvi joins me today. Thanks so much, Vir, for being on the show.
Thank you, Sonia. It's odd. You know, I've been in the studio, I've shot in the studio, I've been a guest on election programs, but I never actually thought anyone would bother to do a one-on-one interview with me. So thank you.
No, Vir, because your memoir is filled with interesting anecdotes about an India which, as I read it, thought actually doesn't exist anymore, because the kind of access that you had as an editor to prime ministers is something that I think people would only dream of with Narendra Modi.
Yes, I think in some ways, at least in terms of the politics and in terms of how journalism function, it's a memoir, bits of it at least, of a vanishing India. I mean, it was an India where the press mattered, where people criticized prime ministers accepted the criticism, talked to you, tried to explain their positions. Now nobody cares. I think journalists count for very little.
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's also because the Prime Minister and the BJP managed to establish a new model of communication which in a sense made journalists irrelevant? You said it laughingly, but I don't think so. I think perhaps the recent pandemics now showed even more why journalism is relevant. How do you think the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, balances this relationship with the media? In a sense, he doesn't need them, but in another way, internationally, he needs them more than ever before.
Well, two elements to it. One, you're right, there's a separate model of communication. They know that through social media they can get their message across, so they don't need the conventional media, which is what they've been saying for a long time. Social media is much easier to manipulate. You can have IT cells and troll farms and love puppets, which they mastered long before anybody else could do, which is what I think gave them the confidence. The second is that media owners and the media on the whole are always susceptible to intimidation and to threats. It is not my case that they've threatened everybody in the media, but it's hard to dispute that there's a certain fear in nearly every television channel, in nearly every newspaper, a sense that you can go this far and no further. So if you have an alternative means of communication and you have most of the media on a leash, why do you need to care?
In a sense, you face that as well, because you had very controversial, strong views on the Prime Minister when he was Chief Minister of Gujarat. That came up, in fact, in an HT summit as well.
Right.
But when you look today, and at that time also you had written that you didn't think that he would ever be Prime Minister of India.
Yes.
I mean, we all know that's not true, and in that you were proved wrong, as many journalists are. How do you think Mr. Modi as Prime Minister has changed India?
I think what Mr. Modi did, unlike, say, Mr. Vajpayee, and that's the real basis of comparison. If you remember, Mr. Vajpayee was elected Prime Minister with a majority much later, but there was a time in 1996 when he had the so-called 13-day government, and nobody was willing to support the BJP. And Mr. Vajpayee was, I think, very upset about the sense that the BJP was untouchable, that nobody cared, nobody aligned with them, he was like beyond the pale. So when he came into office, he tried very hard to show that the BJP did not have horns on its heads, that Muslims were quite safe, etc. And therefore he worked very, very differently. Mr. Modi in Gujarat and here has managed to do what people, including myself, thought was impossible. He has weaponized Hinduism. Many people know that communities can, if they're minorities, can often be weaponized, made insecure, forced to vote or made to vote as minorities. But it's very hard to weaponize a majority, to make a majority feel that it's a victim, that some terrible thing has happened to it, it needs a leader to help it. And he's achieved that, which is a huge, huge miracle in electoral and political terms. And that's what's kept him going, whether it's COVID, whether it's demonetization, whatever it is. People vote for him not because of what he does. They vote for him because of what he is. He is the leader of the majority community who is restoring the honor of the majority community. Mr. Vajpayee never saw himself like that.
So you've actually seen the years, Indira Gandhi through the Sanjay Gandhi years, then of course Rajiv, the Congress at the height of its popularity, a very charismatic young Prime Minister who came in, and then the fall of the Congress in a sense, that the decline of the Gandhis, Narasimha Rao of course keeping the Congress going, and then Sonia Gandhi and Manmohan Singh experiment. Tell us, what do you think of where you've seen the Congress go from that time to now, and do you see some of the mistakes being repeated, and how do you think the Congress can reinvent itself now, because that's clearly what seems to be on the cards now with the new generation taking over?
I think one of Mrs. Gandhi's strengths, and which is why she was able to redefine Indian politics, is she took the line that India since 1947 had been run for the benefit of an elite, for the benefit of the rich, and the syndicate which she opposed, she said represented that elite. Her India would be a new India. And she created a new India, for better or for worse, with bank nationalization, nationalization of grain distribution, many different things. Presumably that didn't work because you had the emergency and she had to resort to all kinds of authoritarian measures. But she stood for something. In the case of Sonia Gandhi and Manmohan Singh, it was very, very different. I think Sonia Gandhi had to try and hold the Congress together. She said to me famously, I think it's in the book, that she used to walk past the pictures of her family and feel a sense of shame, because every day when she watched television, there'd be a BJP spokesman announcing that so-and-so has now joined the BJP. Congressmen were rushing to join the BJP. A not unfamiliar situation from these days. And she felt she had to do something, which is why, having already turned down the job in 1991, she pushed herself into it and she made the Congress revive itself again. What she did, she got it wrong, she lost a couple of elections, but what she did, I think successfully, is that she spotted a gap in the Vajpayee-Advani model, which is, while they concentrated on the lower middle class and the newly emergent middle class and the higher middle class and talked about India shining, they ignored people on the margins of our society. So her appeal was then very much to the Aam Aadmi. There was that slogan, Congress ka haath, Aam Aadmi ke saath. And she concentrated on people who felt neglected, who felt that the fruits of liberalization had not reached them. And I think that's a formula that worked well and won them 2 elections. But it can only take you so far. At the end of the day, somebody else comes along with a big idea, and Mr. Modi did, which is this revolution in which this whole secular nonsense, as he called it, would be junked, and Hindus would take their rightful place in this Hindu nation. That idea caught the imagination of the masses. The problem with the Congress today is that there is no big idea. To say that the Prime Minister is a crook, or the Rafale deal is very bad, or that the RSS have horns on their heads, is to define yourself in opposition to the enemy. You don't do that. You define yourself as yourself, and the Congress hasn't done that.
So, in that sense, you also saw that you had the crisis, Sonia Gandhi balancing the Manmohan Singh, Pranab Mukherjee, and you say in the book also that it was quite clear that Sonia Gandhi did want Manmohan Singh, was always her choice for Prime Minister. Now that's a choice that's been hotly debated on who could have been better, and often much of the blame also for the UPA's disastrous second term and the loss, the rise of Mr. Modi has been placed on Dr. Manmohan Singh. Do you agree?
On all counts. I think the first one, that Manmohan Singh was always her choice. There was a time when they brought down the Vajpayee government, you remember, by 1 vote in a no confidence motion, and they were going to try and form a Congress government when Sonia made her famous "We have 272" statement on the steps of the Rashtrapati Bhavan, which is of course not true, they didn't have it. But at that time, I braced this, the journalist who was working at that time, Ram Pradhan, who was her most trusted advisor then, told me it'll be Manmohan Singh. I was skeptical. I thought Sonia would take the job. I spoke to K.R. Narayanan, who was the president of India, who I knew quite well from before he was president. He said yes. She had said it would be Manmohan Singh. I asked her, what she's like, famously reclusive, but she did not deny it. I met her the evening before the election results were declared, and I said, you do realize the Congress might form the government? And she said, yes, we have a chance. She's notoriously pessimistic. And I said, in that case, are you finally going to take the job, or is it going to be Manmohan again? And she wouldn't answer the question. Now, I found this about Sonia Gandhi, that she's economical in what she says, but she never tells an outright lie. So it struck me then that it was quite likely that Manmohan would get the job. I'd asked Manmohan Singh about this twice in television interviews, and both times he'd seemed eager to get the job and said things like, who doesn't want to be Prime Minister, etc. So the image that he was reluctant is completely wrong. As to your second part of your question, whether I blame him for the rise of Modi, absolutely. I think it's not entirely his fault, but there was a balance within the Congress, and Sonia Gandhi looked after the crisis management, did all the politics, and Manmohan Singh ran the government. It collapsed in the second UPA term when Sonia Gandhi fell ill and went away for large terms, and the crises broke. Some of them self-inflicted. and some of them inflicted by the CAG and various other people. I don't think Manmohan Singh knew how to cope. Manmohan Singh was good when it came to, say, the Indo-US treaty, and he was led to believe by his advisors that the second UPA term was entirely a vote for Manmohan Singh. And when it all began to go wrong, and he had no one to turn to, and he was surrounded by the worst and most incompetent PMO in the history of India, a bunch of idiots. So when they were completely unable to take the situation, instead of figuring out a way to combat the perception that the UPA was scam-ridden, that no decisions were being made, he retreated into a shell and he just kept quiet. That created this huge leadership vacuum. People felt that you had a puppet prime minister who wouldn't say anything. Evil Gandhi is backing him, who were making lots and lots of money. Otherwise, why were there so many scams? And that perception, I think, still bedevils the Congress to this day.
I know, though, as you've said, and he said also that he hopes history will judge him more kindly, but I take that point. And I think, I mean, in the book you've written also, of course, about the whole Radia tapes controversy, where you were also dragged into it, and in the sense it became also part of that whole UPA 2G scam controversy. Do you think, when you look back at it now, you actually fought that, you went to court again saying that you were not involved in the 2G scam in any way, but the larger ethical issues around it, do you think that this was an ethical dilemma for you, an ethical misstep which may have cost you your career as editor?
Not really, because, I mean, first of all, there are huge ethical issues. Why was the tapping done? Neera Adia's phone was apparently tapped for one period, and then they found nothing, and the tap was extended. She was tapped by the finance ministry, which apparently can tap as many phones as it wants with only internal authorization. The reason for the tap, according to the finance ministry, and this is what it told the CBI, was somebody sent an anonymous letter to them saying, why is this woman so rich? And this was enough to tap all her phones, etc., which first of all raises several ethical issues about on what basis are people tapped, which I think the Congress should ask itself when it complains about what's happening with Pegasus and the hacking scandal.
And she was representing the Ratan Tata and Mukesh Ambani at that time.
She was. Yeah, she was running India's largest PR company. So they continued to tap her phones. They found nothing. Even after the scandal broke and the tapes were examined, nobody found any evidence of criminality. But the tapping continued. That's ethical question one. Ethical question two, I mean, as an editor, I'm pretty sure when I was editor of the HT, my phone was tapped by many agencies. Editors work on the assumption that we're going to be tapped. But in a sense, we are secure because we feel that we haven't done anything wrong. Anybody who listens to the tapes will know that, and they will stay with RNAW, IB, Enforcement Directorate, whoever. What happened here was that the tapes were taken out and sold to a business house. They were then kept by that business house, were then tampered with, and were then leaked to the media. And it was a very organized leak because the tapes were delivered to newspaper houses along with transcripts of the purported conversations. And while there were thousands of people on those tapes, they picked, 40, 50 who they thought would make news. So there was clearly an angle there. The government said they didn't know how the tapes were leaked. They didn't know who leaked them. They didn't know who distributed it. So there's another huge ethical question.
And you said both Pranab Mukherjee and Sonia Gandhi actually spoke to you about this.
Yes, I spoke to Pranab Mukherjee when it was happening. And he said, look, I have just taken over. I know for a fact that this tapping was done because that hadn't been announced officially. I don't know why it was done. I know for a fact, and he named 2-3 people in the finance ministry, have run off with the tapes and they are selling them to one businessman, and he indicated who the businessman was, which the laws of libel prevent me from saying. And sure enough, we forgot about it, everybody involved, because though he had said this, sure enough, when there was a 2G scam and when there was questions were raised about some of the players, this huge distraction was created. They had several months now to play around with the tapes, do what they wanted to. The CBI, when it finally got onto the case, said that the tapes were doctored, told the Supreme Court that, said that to the Supreme Court, I think on 3 separate occasions. I had the tapes checked. I had them checked by the FBI approved and MI5 approved organizations abroad. All of them said the tapes were doctored. In one case, you couldn't even recognize my voice on the tape. It had been manipulated so much. And yet, nobody was ever held accountable. Nobody ever found out what happened. It was a 2-day wonder, a great scandal for a few days, and it's forgotten now. There's no accountability.
No, and we're talking about this when the Pegasus controversy is at the heart of it right now. And besides, of course, the absolutely chilling impact that you can tap, goes way beyond tapping. You can actually take over somebody's phone without any knowing who's authorized it, and the fact that it costs crores, who's paying for it. But you can also plant...
and the fact that they've said that only governments are their clients. So almost by definition, a government has to have done this, and it seems extremely unlikely the Hungarian government will want to hack the phone of the woman who accused the Chief Justice of sexual harassment. So you don't have to be a genius to work out which government it probably is.
In fact, just also in the book, what's been interesting is the range of people you've spoken about. You've talked about when Sanjay Gandhi died, when you rang up Murli Deora.
Oh dear, yeah, okay.
Tell us what he said.
Well, as you probably know, Sanjay Gandhi, favorite son of Indira Gandhi, was not a favorite of many Congress people who had, and Sanjay had this tendency to pick on people he thought were commies or were close to his mother and look for ways to humiliate them. P.N. Haksaru, moralist, created Indira Gandhi. His family was humiliated. His uncle was raided. All kinds of terrible things happened. In the case of Murli Devra, who stuck by Indira Gandhi when the Congress split and broke with his mentor, who was Rajni Patel, and said, no, I believe in Indira Gandhi. Sanjay Gandhi went for him anyway. And he had a pretty rough time. Sanjay sent Antule as chief minister, and one of Antule's briefs was to go for Murli Devra. So in those days, there was no internet or anything. So when we got the news, I called up Murli Devra. I had to get a statement for India Today. And I said, I just wanted to get a comment from you. So he said, yeah, what happened? So I said, Sanjay Gandhi is riding a plane crash. He said, Acha, Maria Sala. So I said, yes, he's dead. So he said, oh, all right, take this down. Shri Sanjay Gandhi was a respected youth leader, etc., which is, I think, true of all people when Sanjay died. That's how they felt.
So now we know what all those political statements mean. But also, interestingly, you had a pretty good relationship with Bal Thackeray.
Yeah, I mean, so stone me. Everybody sort of blames me for this, but we really got along.
What did you find in common with Bal Thackeray, who in a sense was a precursor of what you said you don't like about Prime Minister Modi?
Yeah, look, Bal Thackeray was able to distance himself from his politics. That if you didn't know that they went around beating up Gujaratis like me and in the name of Maharashtrian brotherhood or whatever, and you just had dinner with him and he had his warm beer and he told stories, he was a perfectly nice chap to have dinner with. His politics were, as far as he was concerned, something he kept separate. There's the whole thing about you leave your job at the office. There was an element of that about him. Most politicians can talk about nothing else but politics. It consumes them. It becomes their whole life. He wasn't like that. He was proudest of being a cartoonist. He was proud of patterning himself on David Lowe and various people. His great idol at the time was Walt Disney. And I met him in 1980, and he had just returned from America, which I think maybe his first visit. And I said, how was your trip? And he said, wonderful. We went to Disneyland. I met Mickey. I met Donald. I met everybody. So to try and reconcile that with the Bal Thackeray of legend is difficult. But there was more to him than that.
No, but it's interesting in a sense, because can you separate a politician from his politics, especially when it is divisive like Bal Thackeray? But just to ask on that, because you also write about when A.R. Antule became Maharashtra Chief Minister, and when there was much of that kind of dog whistling. You talk also about when Rajiv Gandhi decided to actually go ahead with reversing the Shah Banu judgment, despite advice he had got to the contrary, that there's always been in Indian politics, and this includes the Congress, a very odd way of defining secularism in Indian politics. And that actually perhaps is what led also to Prime Minister Modi's popularity, or what he talked about, and how to make the majority community feel victimized, because they felt that they were left out otherwise in mainstream politics. How do you actually see that?
I have a slightly controversial theory about this. I believe that the vote that Rajiv Gandhi got in 1984-85, the greatest landslide anybody has got, was partly vote for change, partly sympathy vote. But I also believe it was a Hindu vote. Now in our airbrushing and rewriting of history, we forget how Sikh militants targeted Hindus, how many people were assassinated, how many massacres there were. Now, I'm not taking sides in this, but I mean, a massacre is bad. And there was a huge, huge amount of Hindu resentment. Therefore, the attack on the Golden Temple, which I opposed at the time and still oppose because I think it was a disaster, was widely welcomed in India. It was hugely popular. Then, when Mrs. Gandhi was assassinated by Sikhs and there were riots and the public emotion was stoked up, it, I think, further stoked up a sense of Hindus will not be trifled with. I think many people in the Congress, including Arun Nehru, was probably Rajiv's advisor at that time, thought that this was a good chance for the Congress to get rid of this claim that it had a Muslim vote bank and to go for the Hindu vote. And if you look at the things Arun Nehru did, including opening the gates of the Babri Masjid and reviving that dispute, he did it quite cleverly. There was a plan to make sure that the Congress had a Hindu vote bank. The plan failed because Rajiv Gandhi had no interest in Hindu vote banks or whatever. He was still brought up in that old Indira Gandhi era of secularism. So when the Babri Masjid thing happened, he was taken by surprise, didn't know how to handle it. He didn't realize till too late. Vajat Habibullah, who was in the PMO, has written about this, how Arun Nehru did the decision without Rajiv knowing. When the whole Shah Banu thing happened, and the Congress has always been, let's be honest, surrounded by all kinds of Sarkari Muslimans who don't care that much about their community and care much more about their own advancement. They went to him and said it's a great injustice done to Muslims, etc. He reversed it, which he should not have done. And in the case of the satanic verses, which I read about in quite great detail, I think the whole thing was very, very badly handled. Nobody in the government read the book before they banned it. And the second part of it is because the Congress abandoned the Hindu vote, it was there for the taking. Advani first tried to take it and grew the BJP from nowhere to nothing. By the time this Hindu backlash had built up, Mr. Modi came along and weaponized it.
Two other interesting encounters, and in fact I think what's been interesting has been your whole analysis or reading of Amitabh Bachchan. Now he's somebody who's always been, even today, even though he remains superstar, but someone who's still an enigma in some ways. What was your take on Amitabh Bachchan and the various encounters you had with him?
Oh, he is an enigma. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think anybody who claims to understand Amitabh Bachchan is either a liar or a fool. But there were phases in my life when I knew him quite well. And he was, when he was in films, a pretty straightforward guy in that he came from a different background from most people in the film industry. He was very proud of having come from that background. He came from a very cultured family. He had a different kind of education. He liked to come on the sets on time. I was doing the story for India Today in 1980-81, and I spent a week with him, and he would say, I'm going to come to the sets, you come and join me there. And the shift was like 7 or 8 in the morning. The stars would arrive at 10. The director would arrive at 9:30. He would be there on the dot. So unfortunately, I had to wake up early and also sit in his van, wait there. Shatrughan Sinha would then arrive at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock when the shift was ending. And I said to him, you're nuts. You're the big star. Why are you coming on time all the time? You're just going to sit in your van. And he said, no. If I've given a commitment that I will come at this time, I will come at this time. So there was always that element about Amitabh Bachchan. I think the mistake he made in joining politics was he clearly wasn't cut out for it. He's a fairly straightforward person. He joined it for the wrong reasons. He was completely outmaneuvered by VP Singh, who wanted that Allahabad base and didn't know what to do with it. And when Amitabh Bachchan is insecure and out of his depth, he sort of tends to lean on people who claim to be able to guide him out of it, which I think is a mistake he made with Amar Singh, who then sort of took him over and took over his life for several years till they fell out mysteriously.
I know, it's almost like a movie script waiting right there. But
isn't it? I think it's probably be great in the movies he's made.
I know, but finally, Vir Sanghvi, I said, it's been fascinating to read your perspective of really decades that shaped India's politics, decades that changed so much socially as well. But now looking ahead, and right now the whole focus, we're going to have a Central Vista coming up at 75th year of independence. What do you see looking ahead? It's an India where, as we said, it's perhaps you haven't met with this current establishment very much, but you met with Mr. Modi when he was a young BJP leader and very much a rising star. Where do you see this going from now?
Well, let me just say that I met Mr. Modi socially. He came on my show a few times, but we met as sort of two Gujaratis in Delhi rather than as people where he told me his heart's ambitions or dreams. So I can't claim to know what he was like then. But my sense, and it's only a sense, was he was not like this. He was funny, he was accessible, he was open, he met everybody. There was no sense in which he was this imperial Olympian figure that he now is. So maybe he's changed. But watching him now, there is a sense that he is a little, his model is not Vir Savarkar or anybody in that crowd. His model is Indira Gandhi. Indira Gandhi came to power and then changed everything in 1969 when she split the Congress, saying she was going to change India. There was going to be a revolution. I think that is how Mr. Modi sees himself. Indira Gandhi's revolution failed. She nationalized the banks, she destroyed our economy, ultimately had to impose an emergency. So things went wrong for her. So far at least, Mr. Modi is probably as powerful as any leader has been, or more powerful than any leader has been since Indira Gandhi. has been successful in implementing his revolution. And just as Mrs. Gandhi wanted to rid India of the kulaks and fat cats or whatever she said, Mr. Modi wants to rid India of the English-speaking class, the so-called elite, who he feels have kept his supporters down. And all of this, removing memories of things, the office where Nehru worked, trying to rebuild the central vista and give Delhi a Gujarati flavor with Gujarati architects rebuilding everything, I think is part of this grand design. So far it's worked, but as we saw with Indira Gandhi, it all worked till it didn't.
Well, Vir Sanghvi, it's been fascinating having you here on the show. Thank you so much for talking to us. I don't know why you called it a rude life, because you're not rude, you just say it like it is. But thanks so much, and for those of you who haven't read the book, I assure you there's lots more in it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you so much.